Hi, everyone. I'm Tom Baker, and welcome to the 5.0 podcast. Thank you for spending your time, and thank you for the Institute for Criminal Justice Training Reform for providing us this venue for this conversation. Basically, what this podcast is a conversation. The 5.0, it's going to be an ongoing conversation between Randy Shrewsberry, my co-host, and I about criminal justice reform and the people behind that change. So we're going to talk to authors, activists, academics, practitioners, and then people who've at an individual level been impacted by the existing criminal justice system. And it's all going to be with a focus on the problems that we're facing and solutions to those problems, how to create a more just system and administer justice in this country in a fairer way than we are right now. So Randy and I are both former police officers, and we have sort of a viewpoint that maybe isn't as represented in the popular culture as it should be, and that's police and former police officers who are very critical of the existing system. And today, what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about ourselves. We're going to introduce ourselves. We're going to talk about how Randy and I both ended up becoming police officers. We're going to talk a little bit about the relationship between the military and the police that we observed during our time in law enforcement and since we've left. We're going to talk about our own individual experiences in policing and how that impacted us. We talk about a little bit about trauma and how individual officers experience the world when they're involved in the system. We're going to spend some time talking about the role of race and class in policing. It's a lot today. And we're also going to talk about our pathways out of policing. So how we basically this journey into policing, how it impacted us, and then our exit from the profession, and then a little bit about what we're doing now, our work with the Institute, and basically what this podcast is and what our objectives are. So I hope you enjoy it. I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much again. And go ahead and sit back and enjoy. And if you do find this useful, the best way to help is to like, subscribe, share the podcast, because this is a vehicle we're using to help get the word out about the change that's taking place and to get people involved, because we don't want this to be something that happened in 2020 where there was this movement and then it dissipated. We want this to be an ongoing conversation, and we want this change to be long-term and impactful. So thank you very much for your time. Sit back and enjoy. Thank you. So to get things started, I thought it would be a good idea just to get to know Randy a little bit. Randy, can you just, introduce yourself? Maybe start by just telling us, where you grew up, what your parents did for a living.
Sure. First off, Tom, I'm privileged for us to be having these conversations, and I share the sentiment of what you said is where we've spent long periods of time on the phone, and I think at different points we've had breakthroughs of thoughts and ideas or reflections about the criminal justice system. And the name of the 5.0 podcast is because we're both former police officers, and I think as reformists also we come in with a unique perspective of being able to advocate for reform, recognizing what are the practical means that we can move forward. So I live in Los Angeles now, but I'm a native of the Midwest. I grew up in a suburb outside of Cincinnati, Ohio. Middle class, blue collar community. My father was a butcher. They owned like a delicatessen and a butcher shop at some point, and my mother worked along with them. I feel like I come from kind of a unique perspective as being a reformist, especially a supporter of like racial equality and social reform, because those were antithetical to what I grew up with. Unfortunately, I grew up in a home for which discrimination, direct racism was very, very prevalent. And at a very young age, I recognized that a lot of the what's the word I'm looking for? Sorry, a lot of the discourse that my parents were having, it just didn't make sense, right? Is that um, why are we hating groups of people who were just like us, and very often groups of people who were in greater positions of privilege than us, right? I mean, we certainly had some periods of poverty growing up. The other thing about my childhood that I speak pretty openly about is that I'm an adult survivor of abuse, and by both my parents. My father was a raging alcoholic. He has since passed, and there was a lot of chaos and turmoil in our home, and I think that was really kind of my first draw to policing, and certainly years of therapy has shown that that there was a direct line between feelings of injustice inside of my home, those feelings of a lack of control, and then being drawn to a position for which I had some, right? And I could help others attain it. And I think that's common in policing, is that you, at least in my experience, I would see folks that came from similar backgrounds and utilized policing as kind of a stepping stone to get away from it. Now, I think that can backfire as well, right? I mean, I think that that can lend to concerns of abuse of power if it isn't balanced out. But I was probably 12 or 13 years old, and I was exposed to a cadet program at the local police department. I did a ride along. There was a volunteer fire department that was right down the street from where I lived, and so I would go up there even. Part of it was about policing for sure, but I think the bigger thing was about what was about public safety. Right? This is what I think what I was really drawn most to. Did you know at a young age that you wanted to be a police officer? How did you come into it?
No, it was something that I'd always thought of as sort of an option. Like, oh, that's something that I could do. And I think a lot of it had to do just with my my class. Like a working class background. My parents had difficulties when I was young, so they split up. My dad split when I was like 9, and then it was like a single mom for a while. So some housing instability, the financial pressures, all those things. When you live in those types of environments, there are certain roles and jobs and careers that you think are accessible to you. Like I remember my brother had a friend, and they were like these 3 boys, and their dad was a bus driver. He worked for the city as a municipal employee driving a bus. And I remember thinking of that as, wow, that's like a solid career. You make good money, you have benefits, you can retire. And thinking of that as like a sort of an aspirational sort of position, and which is great, like it's great. But that's the sort of class that I was from, where I thought about those types of careers, and policing was one of those careers. I was raised a lot by my grandparents who grew up during the Depression, and remember them talking about police officers are always going to be paid, they're always going to have security. And then the same.
Did you always
go ahead?
Did you always have positive views of the police when you were young, or did you have periods yourself of mischief? I remember a period of shoplifting when I was a kid, but what was your view overall?
I was actually other than smoking pot and drinking underage as a teenager, I didn't really get into much trouble. I was really focused on just partying with my friends, so that was the mischief. So
Sure.
Drinking, smoking pot, trying to chase girls unsuccessfully, and then the other thing was sports. So I think that really was, and I think I really enjoyed having usually these older men who really appreciated that I was good at something and encouraged me. So I was really drawn to baseball and then football, and those consumed just a ton of my time as a kid. So I didn't really, but I had a pretty positive view of policing because I thought of policing a lot like they're like the coaches that I'm interacting with, and they go around and they stop people from beating up their wives, and they do good work, and they can be heavy-handed, and you don't want to disrespect them because they might kick your ass. That was
That's
something
right.
that crossed my mind, and then I understood as a working class kid that's what happens.
Sure.
Because I had friends who got in trouble and did burglaries and shoplifted and did all that stuff and got arrested, and guys who got drunk downtown and got beat up by the police. I was exposed to those things as well. So it was mixed, but generally I would say sort of had a positive view of things.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned sports. I wasn't particularly athletic as a child. I think maybe a year or 2 years I played baseball when I was really young. Late middle schoolish, I played football. But you know what I really like doing in sports more than anything else, and I think this is probably my biggest indicators of wanting to be a police officer, is I like being a referee.
Uh-huh.
That was certainly what I was drawn to. I liked being the arbiter of fairness,
Mm-hmm.
right? Is that I didn't really give a whole hell of a lot about the game itself. It was fun. It was fine, playing, especially like when we played backyard football or whatever. But what I was really drawn to was not, I don't think, at least, in hindsight, that it was necessarily about power trips, right? I don't think that, I wanted to be in control, but I wanted to ensure that that the game was being played fairly. And so, like, as I look back, right, I've been asked before, like, if there was a different path that I took from a career perspective, what would it be? There's a few things, but if I were like in the criminal justice system, it would probably have been to become an attorney, public defender, perhaps, and then eventually be a judge. And I remain enamored by that kind of role in society. That is required. I mean, of all the work that absolutely needs to be done in the criminal justice system, is that there does have to be some mechanism, at least for the foreseeable future. And so I draw all of this, right, to go back exactly to how I was raised, and that feeling of a loss of fairness. When you grow up, especially where there's a lot of substance abuse or alcoholism, is that life isn't fair. Especially for a small child, and then coupling it with abuse. I was actually raised by my dad and stepmother. My stepmother was really the only mother I knew until I was, an adult, because my mother had left too at a very young age. So there was a lot that I think that I was grappling with as it relates to fairness. Now, that being said, as I was also interested in being a pilot, and that to me seemed like an exciting job where you get to travel the world, and later in life, yeah, I've become a private pilot, but and I am pretty glad that I didn't become a commercial pilot. I don't necessarily have any regret there. But one of the things that, as I got to be a young adult, or in my late teens perhaps, is that the question about military was really on my mind. My father was in the Navy. My brother was in the Navy, who didn't have a positive experience, and I remember at 17 having an interest to join the Coast Guard, and again, that's a law enforcement arm anyway. But I was drawn to these regimented experiences, right? Which I think probably has something to do. I don't want to overanalyze my childhood, but I'm sure that had something to do with it. But you are a veteran, and so I chose not to go into the military. My parents wouldn't sign for me at 17, and by 18, I went to work for a police department. But you went into the military,
and that was
that in line with this kind of path into law enforcement?
Yeah, and I think of them as the same, fundamentally the same institutions. You know, they're social control institutions where the use or threat of violence is utilized to compel people to behave a certain way, and one is conducted overseas and the other is conducted in the United States. So they wear different uniforms, but basically they're the same thing.
Well, not terribly different uniforms these days.
Not terribly different. That's
different patches.
Yeah, that sounds like a whole other podcast. I think we could probably find a guest that could talk about that with us.
I hope so. Yes.
So for me, the military was something that was just a logical sort of. It was something for me that was part of becoming a man in my experience. Like that was what I thought I needed to do. Like my great grandparents had in the First World War, and then I was raised by my grandparents quite a bit. And my grandfather would take me down to the Legion, and he fought in the Battle of the Atlantic on escort ships escorting supplies from North America and England. And he was always around his veteran friends, his World War II friends. And then I remember like guys from World War I, were still around, and hearing them tell these stories about all these experiences. And my grandfather was constantly, watching old war movies and documentaries and reading books about the war, and constantly you could tell it was the seminal experience of his life was I went and beat Hitler. Like, that was his, which, good on you. I'm glad you did.
Right.
But it was so in my mind at a very, very young age, from as long as I could remember. And my father was a Vietnam War veteran. They had a very different experience than my grandfather, but it was also, you could tell that it was a seminal moment in his life when my mother remarried years after my father split. She married a British merchant marine and former Navy guy who fought in the Falklands. It was a part of his coming of age. So in my mind, joining the military was something that young men did, and it was part of becoming a man. And so that was something.
Do you think it was romanticized by this, and then was it a letdown by the time you made it into the military?
Absolutely, it was something that I had envisioned, and from films and I had some idea, but I really had no idea what I encountered was totally different, and I have mixed feelings about it, because on the one hand, I'm like, well, I was some poor, working class kid who got sort of driven into the military, and I still feel pain I have injuries, and so I paid a price by doing it. But I also had I think it really helped me. So it helped me get some discipline. I would have never probably gone to university if I hadn't been for the military letting me go to the community college, and So I have mixed feelings, and then also the veteran community that I'm a part of, and some of the friends I've made, and through the Pat Tillman Foundation, some of the best people I know because of that.
But you're a scholar at Pat Tillman.
Yes, so I'm working on my Ph.D. right now, and they basically pay me to go to school. So the Pat Tillman Foundation, they fund my research. Every year they pick 60 people from around the United States, veterans and military spouses, and fund their pursuits. A lot of attorneys, people studying medicine, working in the medical field, business, government, a whole range of subjects. So yeah, for me, the military has been like a very important part of my identity, and that was the road to policing. So like getting out of the military and then being in a position in life where I'm like, okay, well, what's the next stage? And I looked at what was available, and I had these positive impressions of policing. I, like you, want to I don't know if it's be the referee or be the savior, like to try to rescue, I'm going to help this person, and I thought of that was a way I could do that. And there are very few I didn't have a college degree. There are very few professions in the United States where blue collar people can, make a decent living, and I can make a decent living in policing. So that's kind of
right.
what drew me to it.
And did you find in your early days of law enforcement, especially when you went to the training academy, that there was a lot of parallels to kind of like your boot camp training? Or I certainly believe, and I'm not a veteran, but I certainly believe that one of the probably the most common threads between the military and the policing, well, I would say two. Number one is the romanticizing that our society does for police and military. Some rightful, right? I mean, I do believe that what I always say is, there's something to be said about those who run towards danger that the rest are running away from, for sure. I think that, over romanticizing, which is kind of where we have fallen, today, that creates an environment where critique can be inflammatory, right? As you're attacking the soldiers. But the other part that I envision as being a strong similarity is the camaraderie. I have not seen in any profession that I've had in my life outside of being a police officer, anyone that's in my family or partners that I've had that even come close to having the experience of camaraderie as police officers do. Are there other? Do you agree with that sentiment? And are there other things that you see as a carryover from your military years?
Well, the first thing is like what you just talked about, that sense of being a part of a tribe, like the camaraderie.
Yeah.
This being, I was talking about it recently. I can't remember who it was, but I was talking about the feeling of. And this sounds like an like I'm romanticizing it, but this is a feeling that I had, was being out on having a car ditch into a neighborhood and someone bail out and getting in a foot pursuit and getting on the radio and then hearing the sirens of my fellow officers coming to me, and doing that for them and spending all this time and having this sort of shared secrets about what's really happening. And you're living in this isolated culture where over an extended period of time, you maybe have less friends who aren't cops. Your spouse or your partner is friends with partners of cops. Your barbecue is filled with cops. Your kids play on a baseball team with other cops' kids. The coach is a cop. You live in a community where there's a lot of cops. So you get very deeply embedded and it's very similar to the military. It's this, you're wearing the same uniform. You're part of this, group. And it's something that's difficult to give up. It's something that I do miss.
Likewise.
Yeah, and as somebody who's dedicated to reform, very critical of the criminal justice system, sometimes I'm like, man, I sound like I'm it sounds jingoistic, but there's something I think that all human beings desire to be part of, like a tribe. I think it's a natural feeling, and we don't have a lot of those outlets in civilian life.
No. Well, and I would just like to stress, especially for those who may be listening that don't have a lot of exposure to people who have been in law enforcement, is that I believe lawyers hang out with lawyers, right? And I believe that doctors hang out with doctors, and chefs hang out with chefs or other people in the restaurant. Right. This is different, right? This is totally different. This is, and I think that this kind of phrasing is overused sometimes, but this is very much about family, right? Is that exactly what I think that you painted that perfectly. Is that you wear the same uniform. There is an understanding of the stress levels that your brethren, so to speak, goes through. You are given this sense of you have information, right? That the rest of the public don't know. I remember hearing or saying it thousands of times over the years, is like, if the public really knew. But the reality is that was a false statement. But it still, well, in most regards, but it still gave this kind of sense of privilege among this group. Now, that line can blur very, very quickly to become cultish.
Oh
And
yeah.
right, and that's part of my indictment is, and it isn't to say that it's everywhere. But there are certainly pockets of it, and that starts with training, as well.
I found that this is just me, having interacted with a lot of police officers and gone through this myself, having these experiences, but I feel as though as a police officer, being a police officer becomes a significant part of your identity, like who you are, where
Sure.
with more so than other professions. Like if I'm an accountant, I'm an accountant and that's part of who I am, but it's not the same as when you're a police, it really takes over. So when you, to be critical of the institution of policing becomes being critical of thyself. Because it's
Right.
part of who you are. So I think that's a lot of may explain a lot of why so many police officers are reluctant to any type of criticism of police conduct, is because it's an indictment of them. And I think that's difficult to deal with.
It is, and it took me some time. I mean, I recognize problems, and I know we'll chat about this a little bit later in our conversations. But it took me a little bit of time for me to recognize what the problems were. But it even took me a bit longer actually to really talk pretty loudly about it, because it was also it was also pointing out my complicity. Right, is that I had to come to terms that the injustices that I feel that exist inside of the criminal justice system, as well intended as I may have been, I never really thought that that I was a corrupt cop or a crooked cop, but I certainly did a lot of things that contributed to the dysfunction of the criminal justice system, that especially more than anything else, but a lot of other things, but especially subjugates particular communities, especially communities of color. And so to come to terms with that, that's a big pill to swallow, for sure, because even today, there are things that less about specific incidents, right? I mean, I think that all police officers carry particular incidents in their mind. I know, you had a traumatic event, but even outside of that, there are calls that you go on. There are, deaths that you see children dying, or, I remember seeing an infant killed in a car crash. Was thrown, ejected from the car. I pulled a small child out of an 11-year-old boy out of the bottom of a pool who had drowned. Those things certainly leave marks, and that sticks with you. But for me, as the bigger, heavier things that I carry with it is about the systemic problems, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that when I reflect back on my career, what keeps me awake is inactions that I could have taken, albeit small, but because I didn't, it left me complicit. But other kind of structural things, like I didn't know that eyewitness testimony was terrible, right? It's highly unreliable. But I took the word from someone who may have just experienced trauma, whose experience is probably even less reliable. I didn't know that there were folks that at very high levels would offer false confessions. It was unfathomable to me, right? And I never dreamt. So. And even today, I mean, and I know you and I both talk to active police officers, is that very often there is a rejection, I think, about some of these things that are just clearly the case, right? I mean, if we talk about the war on drugs as an example, I had a conversation yesterday with someone who is an active law enforcement officer, and Oregon this past week. We're recording this in the election week. Oregon, decriminalized all substances, and talking to someone about about whether that's the right step, which I certainly think it is. This police officer was like, well, that's not going to solve the problem, or da 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 da. And when I pushed back and said, okay, is what we've done does that work? Immediately his answer was no. Right? I mean, there was no hesitation. He knew that what they were doing doesn't work. But to give up, right? I mean, because I hope at least that this conversation played around in his head as he left for work on his next shift, and a reconsideration when he is coming across someone who has an addiction and is possessing small amounts of personal use of drugs, is that, well, is incarcerating this individual, is that the right path? And I know that we've steered a bit into kind of our experiences into policing, but I'd like to, if you could first share about like how you came. I know you left out of the military and became a police officer, and then what was your early experience? I mean, what was there a realization at some point that like I'm assuming you did in the military and discovered like, wow, this wasn't what I thought it was going to be.
Right. Yeah, for me, well, the early on, well, for quite a while, for years, I really took to it. And I think a lot of it was this, being part of this community, like this tribe of people, like being part of this thing that I thought was, I still do. It's an important function, but I had it in my mind that I was part of this special group of people that would do anything for one another. And we're keeping the community stable so that people can go about their lives and there can be this slow, steady progress. And I really bought into it. And also, I think I was good at it. So I was good at interviewing people. I could get people to talk to me, to confess to things. I was good at figuring out what questions I needed to ask to get information on this thing or the next. I was good at finding people, of leveraging, cases against people to get them to give up the location of somebody. I was, I felt as though I had a real aptitude for it. And sure. The writing, I was better at writing up my reports than a lot of my colleagues. So when you're good at something, like if you're really good at tennis, I think you're gonna like tennis.
That's right.
You're gonna like it. And I feel, and I had also projected the type of masculinity. I was, it's all an act. It's always an act. We're always acting when we're dealing with people. But I knew how to operate in this environment. I had been in the military, and I'd been exposed to this hyper masculine military unit where we're jumping out of airplanes and doing all these sorts of things, and was able to leverage that identity to earn prestige in the organ, to put on this sort of performance of who I am as a man that people identified with for one reason or another. And I felt as though it was an easy path. Like I was able to do well at it. And that really made me enjoy it. And so I was in a deadly force encounter at work, shot and killed someone while responding to a domestic violence call. And immediately after that, I was okay with what had happened. But over an extended period of time, while working through the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and the Occupy protests, and seeing this real disparity between the way people disrupting people's lives through the mismanagement of capital, this lack of culpability, like this no punishments, no reform, no changes, while at the exact same moment, I was out there using the threat or use of violence to compel people to do what I was telling them, and I was putting them in handcuffs and putting them in prison for possessing a firearm, and I was holding them
for far less,
for possession of drugs, for possession of cannabis, which is legal now. which should have been
Right.
legal then. So I put people in prison for selling dope, for selling weed, so while I was holding people accountable for those low level offenses and seeing that this justice was not managed the same way for all people, that it was poor people, disenfranchised communities, migrant communities, Black communities that were disproportionately affected by this enforcement, and then losing my faith, which is what it was, that the system as a whole was functioning and moving forward in a positive way, and this was a negative byproduct, and I could manage that disconnect in my, like I could wash away the problem. But when I lost faith in the system as a whole, it made it much more difficult for me to do my job, because I no longer felt as though I was a police officer maintaining security so we could have slow and steady progress. I was a mercenary for capital. Like, that's kind of the way I started to view once I viewed it that way, it made me sick. Like, I didn't feel good. I felt terrible. And it was just, I hung on as long as I could because of the financial necessity. I had a family, kids, and I was invested in this career. But then eventually, as soon as the opportunity presented itself, I was like, okay, I'm out.
I've heard you describe this before, and you just did now, that it was after your deadly use of force incident, which I think that, certainly from a legal perspective, but even those of us who believe in, that there can be a great deal of reduction of police violence, it is an unfortunate byproduct of a society that we live in. You were fending off an armed attack, and unfortunately, until we get control of guns and take care of mental health and deal with poverty and education, that are all kind of contributors. It's going to be an unfortunate reality that there are going to be instances for which police violence is required. And again, we both agree, I know, that doesn't hold up to the status quo, right? Is that justified and unnecessary, or justified and necessary are two very different terms. Absolutely. Right? And I'd like to talk about those experiences that you had. I had not been involved in that. Perhaps in a podcast for which we're really drilling down in use of force cases, but it seems to be, and I noted this before when you had shared it with me, just one-on-one, is that seemed to be a pivotal moment, even though you were legally justified. Of course, I think that I think that you feel, and I think rightfully so, that you were morally justified. Right? Is that there really wasn't any alternative that you had. But do you think that began shaping, this kind of reevaluation of the criminal justice system, or was it really just kind of a coincidence that the economy collapsed soon after, and or a combination of both?
Well, I think it's the worst thing we're told our whole lives. The worst thing you can do is kill a human being. It's like this. It's a terrible thing. So when you actually do it, I think, this is just me, that I need to now take this incident, this thing that happened in my life, and it needs to make sense. So I need to be able to fit it into the narrative, the story that I'm telling about what the world is and what reality is. And that was a difficult, prolonged task, because it caught over an extended period of time. I started to feel symptoms from post-traumatic stress, and was not sleeping, was having some dreams, and was drinking alcohol to sleep, and that didn't work well. Don't do that if you're having problems. Doesn't work well. So
marijuana does much better.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. If I smoke cannabis, I don't dream at night.
Right.
It just doesn't happen, which is, I don't understand why that is, but for me anyway, and I've read that's common. I'm sorry?
It's about REM.
Oh, yeah, right.
Reduced REM, and which often triggers dreams. But go ahead.
Right. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of promise in cannabis, and I've used it as a medication myself. So I'm a big proponent. So I think that experience left me susceptible to radicalization because it was a difficult process for me to incorporate into my life. And then it primed me so that when I was exposed to these larger systemic issues from the financial crisis and the fallout and this, I was already having difficulty making sense of, so it was like a double whammy. So I think they worked together. If one with just one, I don't think that the change would have taken place. I don't know. You can't disprove a negative, but I think it was the two acting in tandem, being primed by this incident and trying to incorporate it into my life, and then moving into this, it was already happening. Like the crisis was already underway when this happened, and then the fallout, trying to manage both of these things at the same time. And it was very real, the financial crisis, to me. Like they sent out these temporary pink slips, like, hey, we're going to fire X number of police officers. And I was based on seniority within this group. And so thinking, okay, I went and I killed somebody for this organization, and in dealing with this, and now you're telling me you're just going to you're going to fire me? Well,
I can't imagine that it didn't make you feel like a punk, right?
Yeah,
that's disposable.
Yeah, yeah,
or if needed.
Right, and to identify with the people who I was disposing of for the system. So the people that I'm tracking down and putting in jail, they're disposable. They're just being processed by the state, and they don't matter to the system. And now I didn't matter to the system.
Do you think that, when you saw inequality, as an example, about distribution of policing or the application of law, do you think that you saw that, you recognized that at early stages and ignored it, or created some sort of justification in your mind, or did it hound at you at all? And then, and then later on it just kind of boiled over? I don't know how you don't see it.
Yeah, definitely. I saw it. I just sort of, I guess for me, I chopped it. I saw it as part of a larger, more complex process where there are these major systemic issues that lead to disproportional distribution of wealth and opportunity and distribution of police, and not that differently than I view it now, to be honest. It was just the way that I framed it back then was different.
Sure.
It was back then. Go ahead.
Well, I think that I think there is a level of self-preservation, right? That if regardless of really where you are, but especially I think in the criminal justice system, when we're dealing with not only the possibility of taking someone's life, but I think that term is a little loose, right? Is that I did not directly kill anyone, but I took lives,
Absolutely.
right? I took lives of individuals who committed very petty crimes, or committed crimes for which were a result of an addiction, right? People lost their jobs, people lost their homes as a result of my actions. I was giving a talk recently where I talked about this kind of lack of context that is given in policing, right? Everything is kind of viewed very, very two-dimensionally. And I shared a story about, there's always been one that's kind of stuck in my mind, one incident, but it happened numerous times of where somebody would literally, grown adults would be crying, especially men, and say, "Please don't give me a ticket, right? Just a traffic ticket. I'll lose my job if I get another ticket, right? Or I'll lose my job if I get any tickets. If there's any points in my license, I can't drive a company vehicle or whatever." and very callously, I would be like, well, should have thought of that before you were speeding. And then I'd give him a ticket and then drive off speeding to go to 7-Eleven or something, right? And so for me, like, early on, I dismissed any ideas that, that I had a role. My discretion had a role in the outcome of other people's lives. And I have said for the longest time that I do not think that there is a position with more power than a police officer in the United States, more than the president, more than a judge, more than a DA. It's immense amount of power that's given to very young people who very often lack life experience. And that isn't to say that young people, can't be critical thinkers or perform better than I did, for sure. But I know at least my, I don't want to just assume that someone is young and therefore, they're too naive. I was. That turned out in my experience. But one of the things that you've talked about, relative to the 2008 crash, is that I began seeing this kind of disparity even before I became a police officer, because my first job in law enforcement was a dispatcher, and it was for this little tiny department in a town of, I think, about 17,000 people outside of Cincinnati. And I was the overnight 911 dispatcher. And one night we received a radio call. So if you'll entertain my war story, but we received a radio or a 911 call where two women had held down a man and tried to sever his penis. And the man was in his early 20s and had been over at one of the women's daughters, or one of the women's house, who had a daughter who was special needs, pretty high functioning special needs, but certainly with special needs. And he was trying to become sexually active with this girl, and then they were caught. And then these two women came home. They had been out, at an event or something, came home and found him. And they tied him up and tried to sever his penis. So I put out the radio call, right, of what had happened, who it was, who the suspect was, or suspects, the address. And within minutes, this was like 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning, but within minutes, my police chief called and said, "What the fuck are you doing?" I was like, "What do you mean?" And he said, "That's a council member. One of the suspects is a council member of a town, an adjacent town." And he was like, "Never put something like that, over the radio, because the media can pick it up, and citizens listen to scanners." And I thought, so I was 18 at that time, but that to me was like this very first realization that there's two systems of justice here, right? Is that someone, right, who would do something as egregious as, and I'm not defending the offender in this situation, but certainly, vigilantism isn't something that we support in our society, or we purport not to.
Pretty deeply embedded in American culture, the vigilantism.
It is, for sure. But I saw that immediately, like, if that had been out of the trailer park, it was a predominantly white area, it was a rural area. If that had occurred, I would have gotten no phone calls. Right. No one would have blinked an eye about it. There would have been no lecture. I mean, because it went on the next day. I was verbally reprimanded for doing it, and I was confused, but immediately I recognized that this is just a difference in how we treat classes in the United States. And so you spent about a decade, is that right, as a police officer?
Yeah, just about 9 years. Go ahead.
No, please, please.
I was going to say, I experienced it at a much lower level too. So there's this higher level, it became very transparent with this, but I saw that before, like very early on, that and it was, the way I would describe it is that the area I worked in a major city in on the west side of town where there was a lot of call volume, and that there was this very small segment of the population that was intensely targeted, and then the rest of the people, like it was like there were certain things, certain signals that you gave out that identified you as a member of this small segment of the population that was in need of being stopped, in need of being issued a citation, in need of being investigated. And most of the signals that went along with that identity had to do with poverty. It was
Right.
it was the shitbox car. It was
Yep.
the temporary tag. It was the clothes, the look, that went
Absolutely.
along with being very impoverished or a drug addict, or both. And
For sure.
that's what drew the attention to people, in my
Well,
experience.
uh, absolutely, and I think that anyone who's had any experience in law enforcement who would not share that sentiment is either naive in my view or being intellectually dishonest.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, it, it, for me is that I wrote an op-ed a few years ago that was published on Huffington Post called "I Was a Racist Cop," and if you Google that, or we can put it up, uh, uh, and it talks about my complicity of things that I saw that I didn't respond to, some harrowing stories relative to racism, and it is undeniable that racism is an enormous problem inside the criminal justice system. It takes 30 seconds, or let me not be hyperbolic. It takes an hour to sit in a courtroom,
Right.
right, and see the injustices. You don't have to ride along with the cops. You don't have to go visit a jail. You just sit in the courtroom on any level, whether it's a traffic court or it's a felony court or anything in between. But at the same time, is that what I would say is that while policing, as a part of the criminal justice system, is racism intertwined. To me, that the commonality was really about poverty.
Mm-hmm.
This was really about enforcement of poor folk, and so you spent about a decade. I spent just a little bit more than that, but I bounced around a bit. And part of the reason why, part of it was just life circumstances. I got married, and we moved out of state, and then we got divorced, and she moved out of state, and I followed behind. But I also had a really big issue. I mean, in 13 years, I worked at, I think, 6 different agencies and in a slew of different roles, from patrol to supervision to narcotics to warrants to courts to crime prevention. I was a detective, an arson detective, and I worked. The very first department I worked at was literally a one traffic light town. There was 5 police officers, 4 of which were part time, and the chief was full time. In fact, the department doesn't even exist now; it's been abolished. It's just, I mean, I would go days without even a call for service. So everything that I would do would be "quote unquote" proactive policing,
Right.
where I would be looking for something to pull someone over
Mm-hmm.
fishing expeditions. And and then the very last agency in the Indianapolis area is I think it was the second largest department in the state. Um, but the commonality is that there was always this target on poor folks. Is when I worked in the real rural area, there was a population of African Americans of maybe 2, if that. It just was non-existent, and I didn't spend my days sitting outside, this one black folks' house, right? But where I was at the trailer parks,
Right.
right? I was at the construction sites, waiting for someone exactly what you talked about. That'd be in this jalopy car with loud exhaust, or probably expired tag, or some equipment not functioning properly. Because what I knew is that the greater likelihood, based on numbers, if I pull over enough people who are coming from this trailer park, who's coming from this, government housing neighborhood, or from a very blue collar construction site, is that somebody's going to have a warrant, and most of the time it's going to be revolving around an unpaid ticket, or a failure to appear, or their license are suspended because they had an accident with no insurance. All of this was directly tied back to their own financial hardships. But that was just like easy picking.
Well, and right? It's going to give you access to their pockets. It's going to give you access to the car. You're going to, it's a search. You might find something more, maybe not, but it's a way in. Absolutely.
But the other thing that it gives you access to is this. How would I best put it? Is enforcement among voiceless people. No one gave a shit if they called and complained.
A power differential. You're accessing a power differential.
Absolutely. If I pulled over the mayor's kid, right, or not even the mayor's kid, someone who just lives in the mayor's neighborhood, right? There's going to be a call to a council member, to a police chief, to a commander, and they're going to be bitching and saying, "What are you doing fucking with my kid?" And then that's not going to go away. I'm going to get called into the car, into the carpet for it, and they're going to be like, "What are you doing?" But if it's someone that just worked a 12-hour shift hanging drywall someplace, and I stop them and they have a license, suspended license, especially if I stop them for something that was totally pretextual, like a tail light out, or some improper license plate, or I don't remember what the charge was, like if your license plate isn't screwed on correctly to the car.
Right. Or you've got one of those things that obstruct the edge of the plate, and there has to be a certain distance, and decals in the back window need to be, and every state has it. For people who aren't familiar, there's usually a whole section of laws that relate to traffic control. And if you are a police officer and you have any clue, you can identify 10 or 12 of them, learn them, and then follow a car. And within 5 minutes, pretty much any vehicle you can, if you want to, you can find a reason to pull them over.
My largest marijuana bust in my entire career came in the Cincinnati area. I was working in an urban area. It was a small village in Ohio, but it was just outside of downtown, just a couple of miles from downtown Cincinnati. Vine Street cut right through it. It was a poor area. But I saw a guy, this long hair hippie guy driving this old Mustang. It was early in the morning of Memorial Day, and we pull up to the traffic light facing each other, and it was like 4 a.m, and he wouldn't turn right on red, and because he knew I could follow right behind him, so I think he wanted to see where I was going. So he had sparked my attention, and I was like, I've got to find a reason to stop this guy. And what I stopped him for was a law in Ohio that was called focus and aim of headlights. He had one headlight that was out of balance, and it was kind of, we used to call them possum hunters, right? It's like pointing up at a tree. Is there a purpose for why, people's headlights need to be straight? For sure, of course. I don't know that, that we need to be pulling people over. There needs to be an armed encounter with that. But I agree with you. Like, it was always astonishing to me, like where I would see officers who would make up bullshit to pull somebody over, and I'd be like, why? They'd lie and say they weep. Why? Just stay behind them for a few minutes, or really just look over their car. You're going to find something, because all of us, everybody, there isn't a soul that can drive without violating. We have 50,000 laws in the United States, not including like administrative laws or laws that govern like industry or workplace, but criminal and traffic laws. So it isn't too terribly hard.
No, and that's where the power that you talked about before, this like immense power that the patrol officer has over their beat, comes from that wide array of laws that can be drawn upon as a resource. And there's discretion. So you decide what you're going to be interested in. You decide how you're going to manage these cases. There's a lot of discretion involved in this.
That's right. And how dare somebody challenge that, this is a bullshit, thing. For me, though, one of the things that I found, because I never worked patrol in a really large department. The large departments that I did work in, one I was working patrol, but part of my district was relatively rural. I worked at a sheriff's office outside of Charleston, South Carolina. But never where I worked in patrol was there high call for service volumes, right? Like we see in LA. There were days, of course, like you sign on and there's a backlog of calls. But what I experienced more than anything was boredom. Mm-hmm. Right. It was not at all. Even those agencies where I was very busy, I was never busy, fighting, violent crime. I was never busy solving rapes or murders or, and I think that also contributed to my kind of bouncing around is that I was looking for this panacea that did not exist. And but the other issue that I had, and I don't mean this, it kind of comes across disparaging of all police officers, and I don't mean it that way, but there was a difference of personalities, right? I've always been a bit of a liberal person, and policing is a heavily conservative line of work, right? I would find that people were okay with violating other people's rights, right? Especially like Fourth Amendment stuff, like search and seizure, stopping someone and having them empty their pockets out, right?
Oh yeah, like a lot of.
Which doesn't seem like a big deal, except if you're on the receiving end of it, right? And you talked about the hypermasculinity, people like really entrenched in guns, and that was just never a really big interest to me. It's funny too, because and I had not heard you say these things in totality before, but like I was a really good report writer, always have been. I've gotten commendations for investigative reports from not only departments head but from DAs and judges. When I've done defense work, I've always been applauded about my writing skills. And, the joke we always told about policing is the reason why police officers wear name tags is so they know how to spell their name. So there's a reference. And certainly, I don't make the implication that was just kind of a dark humor joke. But also, I thrive on critical thinking. And so, I was always drawn to kind of investigations. So some of the things that I just didn't like is I didn't like the politics behind it, right? I didn't like knowing that if I pulled over the wrong person, if I arrested the wrong person, if I announced on a 911 call the suspect's name of the wrong family, that, that I was going to be drug in. But I also struggled with boredom, and I struggled with what I viewed as a lack of empathy, right? Is that it was this very just kind of simple, there's good guys and there are bad guys, we're the good guys. Even people who aren't criminals, quote unquote, there was always this view that they were just criminals in wait, right? That everybody was,
right,
at any moment could be flipped to be this diabolical criminal. I remember arresting a woman. This was very pivotal. I think it was in my last year, maybe two. It was my last year of policing. That a woman who had violated the terms of home incarceration. She had a warrant, and I was sent out. I was doing warrants at the time, and I was sent out to pick her up. And she on the way to the jail, we were just in conversation, and she talked about her struggles with drug addiction. And I asked her what was the pivotal moment, because she was in her probably late 30s, and she had said, most of her life, she was a quote unquote law-abiding citizen. And she described that her 4 children and husband died in a fire, but she was the only person to escape. And I remember thinking, Tom, I was like, and I'm taking this woman to jail, right? Of course she's an addict.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, who comes out of something like that okay? But that is just very antithetical to the training and policing, or the environment policing. And then a lot of it was, the old adage of, a frog in a boiling pot. If you throw him in when it's boiling, he'll jump right back out. But if you slowly, bring it to boil, he'll die. There was a great deal of that. So a lot of things I didn't see until I was out of it. And to be very honest with you, and I've now been out of it since I think 2006, 2007 was the last law enforcement role that I had. I still learn things. I still kind of, day to day. I just, like when you were talking earlier about how, how we are kind of mercenaries, or we're mercenaries for the state to enforce these rules of capitalism, where there's segments of the population that there's no enforcement. I recently just saw this very short video clip where someone had said, think of it this way, in this perspective, is if you steal $50 from your employer, they call the police.
Right.
You go to jail. You're charged with larceny. You're going to lose your job. It's going to wreck. You're probably going to have a hard time getting a job. If the employer steals $50 from you, which is the number I now know is the number one type of theft, it's a civil matter. You can't call I can't call the cops and say, "Hey, my boss stole $50 from me."
Right.
The cops would laugh at you. But theft is theft, right? And so then you're left with looking at what is the difference. I literally just heard about someone put it in those terms easily in the last 2 weeks. And I was like, holy shit, that's absolutely right. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, and I never really thought of it that way.